Hands on, feet on, powered on your mark. On is the start of everything. On is the key to learning. Being on an environment, not just in it. Being on the world, not just of it.
Tarkett understands how important On is.
We work on it every day. On the ground with you, designing flooring experiences to grow on, dream on, and get on with it.
Welcome. My name is Christy Avalos, and I am president and CEO of a company called Accessology. We do nothing but access issues, and I personally have been doing access issues since 1977, so I've been around a while. I was also on the White House lawn the day ADA was signed, and I do a lot of expert witnessing on access-related cases. So what we're going to be talking about today is not necessarily what the law says, although I can certainly entertain questions about the law. But it's more about the application and going maybe a little above and beyond to provide a really inviting learning opportunity for people with disabilities. So let's just kind of talk first about the number of people with disabilities. Now, these are just the numbers of people that are registered with an IDEA program nationwide. Okay, and this is taking all education K through 12 into consideration. So we've got roughly 28% in the city, 34% in the suburbs, 24% in smaller towns, and then 18% in very rural areas. And the reason that I mention that is because that surprises a lot of people, that we have people with disabilities even out in the rural areas. As a matter of fact, the numbers are pretty close if you look at them. Now, this is all types of disabilities. So this is physical, sensory, cognitive. This encompasses all of the different disability groups in the services that they're getting through the federal government. And so I just kind of wanted you to see that. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that you are willing to highlight the accessibility. So if you're doing a full campus, especially if you're designing it kind of ground up, whether we're talking about an elementary school or a high school campus, middle school, whatever it is that you're involved in, this particular map shows the accessible routes to everything, including the various sports venues, and having something like that provides a visual on what the accessible routes are for any student that might have a mobility or use a mobility aid, I think is a really important element and something that should be incorporated in from your site plan. Now, we also have to get them to the school, and that includes sometimes public transportation, depending on where they live, and sometimes it's local bus stops and things like that. But an accessible bus stop is going to be imperative if they're taking any type of public transportation. Getting a person who uses a mobility aid to and from a bus stop when it's nothing more than a sign in the grass is sometimes very challenging. And so I just kind of want people thinking all the way from the outside, how are they going to be arriving at the school? You may have nothing to do with the bus stops, but you certainly will have something to do with what happens when they get to the school. And so we need to look at the various entrance points with a new school. And whenever I say new, I'm referring to anything that has been built since January 26, 1992. So even though that was almost 30 years ago, that's when the ADA went into effect. And that is what they consider as new under the ADA. Now, if it's been built since March 15th, 2012, it's going to have a different set of standards. And so We always have to look at what was in place at the time that the building was built, but if you're doing an alteration, you're going to be altering it to the current standards, which are the 2010 ADA standards that went into full effect on March 15th, 2012. So one of the things that people don't seem to realize is that the ADA does not require you to have power doors, power assisted doors. It's not a requirement. It's a good idea. Nothing's going to get a school district or a college or university or even a company. Nothing's going to get a complaint faster than if somebody can't get into the building to begin with. However, they're not a requirement. And it is important to make that distinction. Now, we're always going to recommend power assisted doors because it is so much easier for people who have any type of mobility impairment, upper or lower extremity. But if you don't have power assisted doors, or if you're in an older school or an older district, then anytime you have a non-accessible door, you need to have a sign like we have on the right. All non-accessible entrances are required to be identified as non-accessible and have a sign that indicates the location of the nearest accessible entrance. At least 50% of the entrances for the facilities built from 1992 on should be accessible, or 60% if they have been built since March 15th, 2012. So some of the entrances should be fully accessible, and those that aren't need to be identified with an indication of the closest accessible entrance. Now, people get really ridiculous sometimes in providing access. If there is a way to not put this kind of a mess in front of a building, then we certainly want to not put this kind of mess in front of a building. You know, sometimes you just don't have a whole lot of option, but we do want to look at providing access in a way that it is inviting, not an afterthought, not a look what we had to do because the government told us what we had to do, but in a way that it is incorporated and inclusive so everybody feels welcome. And when we see things like, you know, these 7, 8, 9, 10 rung switchbacks, I just know we could have come up with a better idea. And so really the less intrusive, the better. When it comes to entry points, these detectable warnings tell somebody who has low or no vision that they're about to step into a vehicular hazard. Now, some states require the bollards for safety purposes, and some don't. But the detectable warnings should always divide where the students are being dropped off and you know, where the pedestrian elements are and where the vehicular elements are. And that way, if somebody has low or no vision, the color differential is for people with low vision. The texture differential is for people with no vision. And that way they know that they're about to step into a vehicular area where there could be potential danger. And so we want to make sure that we are identifying that appropriately. So today we're going to talk about, now that we've kind of gotten the getting to the building out of the way, inside of the building, there are 4 main categories of people that we need to think about when we're designing. The first is a person with a physical disability. Usually that's going to be somebody who either has trouble walking or uses some type of a mobility aid, canes, crutches, walkers, wheelchairs, that kind of thing. It could be somebody who only has one arm. It could be, you know, any number of physical disabilities. Then we've got hearing disabilities, and that's going to include anything from low hearing to no hearing. And the same with visual disabilities, from low vision to no vision. And then there's a whole spectrum of learning disabilities, and we're going to talk about some of those as we move forward. So let's start with physical disabilities. Of course, you have to comply with laws and standards. We have federal laws, we have the ADA. We also have, and for those of you who do direct design work, it's really important that you understand that ADA is not the only law that affects what you do, because there's another law that is it's a federal law, and it was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and specifically Section 504. Now, 504 calls for any educational institute that receives any federal funding to be compliant with all of their program services and activities. Well, what that means, because program services and activities is so broad, everything that they do is either a program, a service, or an activity. And so the sidewalks that lead between the various elements on the site are part of their pedestrian program. And all of those are required to be compliant. And the reason that I'm kind of making that point clear is because when somebody sues under the ADA, all they do is force compliance. There are no punitive or compensatory damages. So it's not a get-rich-quick scheme for the disabled. If, however, it's also a 504 violation and they're able to bring 504 into the lawsuit, 504 does have both punitive and compensatory damages, and therefore it can become a much more expensive case. And so nationwide, we have people who pay close attention to ADA, but they don't realize the implication of some of the other laws. So of course, you've got federal laws and you've got state laws, and in some cases, local laws. And then, of course, building codes. And Chapter 11 of the International Building Code is all about accessibility. And you have to comply with all of them. You don't just get to pick which one you like the best. You have to comply with all of them. So if one says a curb ramp has to be 3 feet wide and another says 4 feet wide, and the third one says 5 feet wide, then you have to make them 5 feet wide because that satisfies all three. So you have to pick the strictest element of each. And that makes it sometimes confusing and very time consuming. And so just be aware that you have that obligation, but the litigation, most of the litigation is going to go through the federal courts. And so it's the federal laws that can get you in the most trouble. Then there's also the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. The letter of the law tells you technically what you have to have. The spirit of the law tells you what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes when you're trying to achieve something, you need to do better than the letter of the law. And once you do better than the letter of the law, you can actually market that. And that can become a huge opportunity for your firm as well as for your client. So it's important to understand that distinction. And I'll get there with you in just a little bit. And then there's full inclusion. So full inclusion is really taking the mentality from what is the least we have to do to not get sued to what is the best that we can do for the students in this particular project, this particular facility. If you don't do anything else except change your thought process from what do I have to do to how can I best serve the population, you almost will eliminate a lot of the ability for people to come after you for non-compliant design. Okay, remember that the standards are the absolute minimums and maximums. You can always do better. And we're gonna kind of talk about that as we move forward. Now, here's an example. Laws allow you to put in a lift, okay? But good design doesn't. If you're doing truly good design, then you really wouldn't have a need for a lift. Now, you might have good design in a very old building where you just don't have a choice. And I certainly understand that. When you've got existing conditions that you have to overcome, that's the reason that lifts are allowed. But if you're putting lifts into something that is brand new construction, you might want to rethink that. A ramp is less maintenance. They don't break down. Nobody has to find the key. Nobody can play on them and get hurt. And there's just a lot of reasons to use a ramp instead of a lift. But the law is going to allow a lift. The law allows thresholds at doorways. But if you can provide a smooth transition, then that's better. So that would be a better design. And as I just mentioned, ramps are good design, but a sloped walk is even better. So a ramp doesn't become a ramp until you hit 5%. You could go 4,000 feet at 4.5%, and you don't have to put handrails on both sides, and you don't have to do level landing areas, and you don't have to treat it as a ramp. So if you've got the room, design your sloped elements under 5%, and then you don't have to worry about skateboarders on the handrails and all of those other elements that go with a ramp. So that would be an even better design, and it's a gentler slope. So what the law says is that you have to provide access to the maximum extent feasible. Maximum extent feasible. Okay, so again, that bears understanding that it doesn't say do the least you have to do. Maximum extent feasible. So what's feasible for your project? What's feasible for a historic renovation is going to be very different than what's feasible for new construction. But we still have to figure out what is the best that we can do with the variables and the circumstances for this particular project. There is not a one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to accessibility. Another thing that we see a lot of, you're required to have a lowered section of counter. The law requires that. But it's always full of computer equipment or brochures and flowers and all of these other things. And so if we design it in a way that a computer monitor is not going to go there, we have a better place for a computer monitor, and we have additional areas where they can put their brochures and their flowers and their candy dishes and all of that, then we're leaving that lowered counter open for what it's intended for, which is communication between somebody who is either of short stature or somebody who's in a wheelchair and the person behind the desk. But if we fill it with stuff, then technically you're meeting the law because you've got that lowered section, but they can't use it for communication purposes. And so those are the kinds of things that we want to be thinking through. Again, not just meeting the law, but seeing how we can best serve the population. Remember, we got about 28% of the students. If we're talking about a city, we've got about 28% of the students that have some type of disability. Now, think about a child who is getting ready to graduate. Okay, now they get in line with all of their classmates, and they start heading up to the stage, but they've got to go off to the side and get on some kind of platform lift and then wait for that thing, which is usually loud and bumpy, to get them up to the right level and get them off. Or they can just go up a ramp along with the rest of the students. Which would you rather do if it were you, or if it was your child? Would you rather have to go out of the room and around to a back ramp somewhere to get up onto the stage? Or would you want to access the stage from the same area that everybody else is? And so when you think about the use of a variety of these different spaces, auditoriums can be used for anything from lectures to plays and concerts. And if people are coming up onto the stage from within the audience, then we ought to have a route for people to get up onto the stage from within the audience. As a matter of fact, if it's been built since March 15th, 2012, that's a requirement now. But even if it's not a requirement, it's still a good idea. It's still something that we should do to try to make sure that we're able to get people onto the stage for whatever reason they might want to be on the stage. And I mentioned earlier, laws allow thresholds, but if we can put flooring together without any level change between them, that's always going to be preferred. The smoother the path of travel, the easier it is for more people. Sure, a person in a manual wheelchair can bump over a threshold, but it might be harder for somebody using a walker. It really is about better design. And there's a lot of really creative ways of doing transitioning from one type of floor to another. Like I said, ramps are good design, but if we just slope the walk and it's less than 5%, then incorporate that into the design, and you've got some really, really beautiful, inclusive opportunities that work for everybody. And that's really what ADA is about. You know, ADA doesn't say you have to do anything. It doesn't say you have to have restrooms. Plumbing code says you have to have restrooms. ADA says if you have them, they have to work for everybody. So if the school district says you have to have a library, ADA says it has to work for everybody. And that's really how it works. ADA is about including everybody in your design, regardless of who they are or what their abilities are. Now, laws are very specific, okay? They're going to tell you what your slope has to be and the width of that and all of these different things, but your design can just be inclusive. We can have different height desks for people who are at different heights. You can put things on soft furniture and movable furniture. So if there's a student in a wheelchair, they can be moving around with the furniture instead of having to try to figure out where to sit when everything is built in and secured in place. Like I said before, the laws require the lowered counter, and they tell you it has to be at least 36 inches wide at a 36-inch high height. But if that space gets full of junk, then it doesn't provide that communication opportunity that that the intention of that law was for, or that standard. So inside of the school environment, we want kids to be kids. We want kids to learn. For instance, being a research scientist, that is a great opportunity for a child who has a disability, that has a physical disability, where they're using their mind to the best of its ability. And so providing good science rooms that have inclusive workstations, that have the opportunity for anything that goes on in that science room or the lab, having them have the ability to get access to all of it, to learn, those are great opportunities for people with disabilities. When you are limited, and I met this boy one time. He was 13 years old. He had muscular dystrophy, and we were sitting listening to the radio one night, and he goes, "I think I'll be a disc jockey when I grow up." And I went, "Why, Larry? Do you like the radio?" And he goes, "Not really." I went, "Well, then why would you be a disc jockey?" And he said, "Well, let's face it, what I really want to be is a pro football player, and we all know that's not going to happen." And there was something about that statement that reminded me that this was a young boy. He had the same hopes and dreams and goals and desires as every other young boy in America. And usually that's either to be a pro sports player or a firefighter or a police officer. And those are three things that they probably can't do if they have muscular dystrophy. But to be a research scientist, all of these other opportunities, all it takes is that one teacher that sparks that interest in that child, and they can change their entire life. And all it takes from you is making that so that it's possible. And I think that's a really powerful place for you to be in. It also increases communication. When a child sees all of the different opportunities, instead of seeing all of their limitations, then they can dream just like every other child. And then they can implement what they've learned and build a career out of it. And that's all any of us want. And for those who are parents of students with disabilities, that's what they're going to fight for. They're going to fight for their child to have the same opportunities as everybody else. And so a lot of that can be done through good design. Now, hearing disabilities is a little bit different. It's not as much about the built environment as it is for somebody with a physical disability. As a matter of fact, one of the things I heard once that I thought was really powerful is that of all of the minorities in the world, The disability minority is the only minority that can be discriminated against by the built environment. One step says you're not welcome here. And that's pretty powerful. But when it comes to somebody with a hearing disability, it really depends. There's a huge spectrum. Those of us who are able-bodied tend to think about a person with a hearing disability as being deaf. But they could just have low hearing. And the needs are going to vary depending on what abilities they do have, just like anything else. The relationship, the dimensions, the movements within the spaces are all going to be different, as well as the volume and the purpose of sounds, depending on what they hear. However, there are several general considerations to take into account so that you can design spaces that are more acoustically comfortable for people with hearing impairments, especially when you know that there are students with hearing impairments in the school. So let's look at some of that. First of all, some of the variations. When people have hearing loss, there are different ways of communicating. Some of them are going to write notes back and forth or type into their cell phone and show notes back and forth. Some of them will use an assistive device, like there's a thing called a Nubi Duo, and it looks like the game Battleship. You've got a keyboard and a screen, and they've got a keyboard and a screen, and you just type back and forth, and it's a live conversation. So you don't have to wait for them to finish and then read, and then, there's no delay, it's live. Then there's things like sign language. And then there's oral speaking. And there are a lot of people with hearing impairments that are going to speak orally. They may have a bit of an impediment to their speech. But they can communicate pretty well. So these various types of communication can really be enhanced by the built environment. So if we have a space that is round, for instance, instead of linear, then they can face the people that they're talking to. And so good design is going to include some pretty good round communication pits and things like that. Now, this is kind of interesting. Only a third of spoken words can be understood by somebody who reads lips. Okay, and just for your own edification, if you notice that somebody is reading your lips, just continue speaking normally. What we tend to do is start over enunciating, and they can't understand that. And it's a whole other language. So if you notice somebody is reading your lips, then first of all, speak in your normal speech patterns and keep your hands away from your face. Okay, because as soon as we realize somebody's reading our lips all of a sudden feel dry, So especially if you've got a member of the team, the design team, or your client's team that is hearing impaired, make sure that you're providing good and effective communication. So the key to create your spatial conditions for good communication and allow for the other methods that we just mentioned of communication, we want to make sure that people can face each other as much as possible. And so whether the room is square, but we set up some rounded areas, the more we can have people facing each other, the easier it's going to be for communication. Now, I don't know about you, but you have probably noticed through this pandemic that it's hard to hear people when they're wearing a mask. And is it that little piece of material really blocks that much sound? It's not. It's that you're used to reading their lips. You don't realize it, but we get a lot of what we get from people by reading their lips. And now we've covered up their lips and our brain is going, wait, I'm not getting as much information as I usually get. And it sounds like it's more muffled. And of course there is some muffling, but it really has a lot to do with the fact that we're not getting two types of communication when we're talking to people. But now imagine that you're hearing impaired and that's how you pick up what is happening. You read lips. Now we're all covered in masks. That makes communication nearly impossible for a person with low hearing. and impossible for somebody who is deaf. Okay, and so it's things like that that we take for granted. We don't really think about. Now, light plays a huge part when it comes to communication. The lights need to enhance the environment, but not cause glare. And the more lighting, the easier it is for them to see facial expressions, as well as, to see lips for communication purposes. Now, colors that contrast with skin tones help other people better perceive their facial expressions as well. And so if they're in a beige room with beige walls, wearing beige clothes, it's going to get really, really boring. So bright, vibrant colors that aren't going to parallel anybody's skin color is going to provide an easier way for the eyes to adjust and see the faces for communication purposes. So those are things that often, and they're not in the law, but they're part of good design. Color, shadows, and even vibrations can help people with hearing limitations better. It helps them better understand or be alert to their environment or their surroundings. There's so many different things that you can do with acoustics. And of course, we think of acoustics for music rooms and for auditoriums, but acoustics are just as important in an elementary classroom as they are in the music room, when we're talking about kids who have a variety of different levels of hearing. The multisensory design actually started all the way back in the 1950s. At the time, it was more of almost a hobby. They proposed that spaces were a little bit more enjoyable when all of the senses were utilized, and nobody really thought about it. If you think about older classrooms, I'm been around since 1960. So I remember when classrooms, all of the floors were the same, all of the walls were the same, all of the lockers were the same color. It was, it wasn't about inviting spaces like it is today. And, but they did notice all the way back in the 50s that you can use your senses in different areas. And the more multi-sensory you can make the space, the wider range of users are going to be able to learn in the space and appreciate the space. It's way more inclusive. Now, regardless of grade, people who have low hearing levels do perceive sound in ways that can be highly distracting and sometimes even painful. If they're using some type of an assistive listening system, certain types of noises can come through, really, piercing noises and things like that. And so we need to be thinking about that. For instance, the ADA talks about anytime that you have audible communication integral to the use of the space and a microphone is used, that you have to have assistive listening systems for people who have low hearing. But they don't tell you what type you have to have. There are portable ones. Those are going to be the cheapest. You can also build a loop into the ceiling. Well, building a loop is going to be the most effective. It's also going to be more expensive. But if that's included in the budget, if that's something that we think about, especially when we know we have a higher percentage of people with hearing impairments, that's going to provide the best solution. And it does take making sure that it gets built into the room. And so there's lots of different ways of providing the same service. Some are not quite as effective as the others. That reverberation that is caused by sound waves and it reflects off harder surfaces, that can become a real distraction. And like I said, it can even become painful. Now, there is a program at Gallaudet University, and if you're not familiar with Gallaudet, it's a university that is is run by and for people who are deaf. And they have a program that they put in place called Deaf Space. And you can go to Gallaudet University's website and you can find Deaf Space. And according to Deaf Space, the inclusive design culture includes very simple solutions. It's not about having to do a whole lot more. It's got more to do with what you choose in terms of your furniture and your flooring and your wall types and things like that, to make sure that sound is traveling in a way that is easier for people to understand it. So simple solutions can occur by thinking about the absorbency of the material. You know, like I said a minute ago, the acoustics and reflective materials to reduce that intensity of sound and that travels from one space to another. Avoid overly bright surfaces or materials in the floors or furnishings, because that can cause noise on contact, like when you're moving furniture, or it can transmit vibrations like floors of wood that vibrate when people walk. You and I don't normally think about how that affects sound because we take our hearing for granted. But there are a lot of things to look at and to research that will affect sound and provide good information for good design. Now, when we're talking about somebody with a visual disability, it's the same thing. There are a lot of different needs. I wear glasses. That's a visual disability. Then there are people who are totally blind, and there's everything in between. And so whether it is a minimal, moderate, or severe learning disability or a visual disability, they still want to participate in what the other kids are participating in. And think about sitting in a classroom and how much writing goes on the blackboard, or at this point it's whiteboards. I just showed my age. But just, you know, think about the different things that happen in a classroom that you don't really get to be part of if you can't see. And so we need to look at some of those things. So let's just kind of look at some of the different types of visual impairments. You can have somebody who has glaucoma. Now, you generally don't see that in kids, but it does happen in kids. And there are a lot of different eye diseases that can make patterns in the vision. And so those are usually people who are going to turn their head back and forth to try to get you in their line of sight. And it's not that there's a cognitive disability, which is what a lot of us think. It's really just they're just trying to get you where they can see you. We can have people with blurred vision. Sometimes it is so blurry that when you say it's over there under the yellow sign, they're going to go, what yellow sign? And then we get frustrated with them because we're like, that big yellow sign right over there. Well, you know, they can't see that. And so when the light comes in, the eyeball will look normal. Okay. So you don't always know what they can't see. Of course, when somebody is profoundly blind, then that you can usually tell. There's also macular degeneration, and that also is mostly for adults, but you will have some people who it starts at a very young age and becomes progressive as they go through their school years. And then, of course, total blindness. And so when you start thinking about all of the different variations of what people may or may not see, then it helps us start thinking about the things that we can do from a design perspective to help. Okay, so for instance, having something like having equipment, a lot of the things that help people who are visually impaired are going to be equipment based. They're going to be readers that will read websites for them. There's going to be magnifiers. There's a lot of technology that can be put in place. And from a design standpoint, All you really need to do is make sure there's room for this type of technology to be utilized. But there's a lot more that you can do. So for instance, having a good contrast between the door and the wall, so that if they have low vision, they can clearly see where the doors are. Those visual contrasts are incredibly important. Another one that's really important is the base. If our baseboard is the same color as the wall, it throws off their depth perception if they have certain types of low vision. And so by making sure that base that is along the wall is a different color than the wall itself, that helps in terms of their depth perception. One of the things that people don't think about, let's say you just change the flooring in front of the restrooms. Now we have a child who is going from their classroom to the restroom. They feel the flooring change and they can go right into the restroom. That's easy. Why make them feel around dirty walls for signs if we can indicate to them that, hey, you've just gotten to the restrooms, and they can tell. If they use a cane, they're going to hear the difference, and if they use a dog, they're going to feel the difference, and that allows them to get into or to identify different spaces. You could even go so far as to have floor changing in front of entry doors to classrooms, or so that they know that their classroom is the third one on the right, so they just count the flooring changes to get down to that classroom. There's really a lot of things that you can do like that really help design. Wall textures can be changed and used as directional tools to help them orient themselves. Or you can have, if you've got different wings or different pods, and you've got, the A pod and B pod and C pod, and you've got things that are textural that they can feel, that they always know what hallway they're in or what pod they're in, and they can figure out and orient themselves to where that pod is from where the lunchroom is. And so the various textures on the walls are very helpful. Sometimes we think that we have to flip-flop the restrooms. You go to one set of restrooms and you got the boys on the left and the women's on the right, and you go to the other set and you've got the girls on the left and the boys on the right. Why not make them consistent? So then we change the flooring in front of the restrooms. They get to that flooring change. They know that the boys is always on the left and the girls is always on the right, because girls are always right. Anyway, if you orient that way instead of flip-flopping, then whether somebody has a cognitive disability or a visual disability, they're able to memorize, when I hit that flooring change, I go to the right. It's a brilliant way to help people navigate a building. Now, consistency is imperative. When somebody is visually impaired, the reason the signage has to be the way that it has to be is, first of all, because we want there to be standardization. So they're going to feel for the doorknob, and they're going to feel the wall next to that, that door to find the signage. Okay. Now, you have to have, well, first of all, you don't have to have any signage. ADA doesn't say you have to have signage. Schools generally have signage. ADA just says if you have it, it has to comply. Now, in something like this, Miss Mefford could be, fired and gone tomorrow. It's still going to be room 14. So the 14, the 014, is all that has to have the raised texture in the braille. Okay, you don't have to do the logo. You don't have to do the person's name. Now, you might want to have one that says library. Anything that designates permanent spaces, library, cafeteria, counselor's office, those kinds of things that identify permanent spaces. If the person in there is gone, it's still going to be that room. That's what we need to have in raised texture and braille. The raised texture is for if somebody doesn't read Braille, or if for whatever reason the Braille is confusing to them, they can trace the numbers or the letters. Okay, we don't want those signs to be on the door, because then they have to step into the room to figure out that they're in that room. We want them to be able to figure that out before they enter the room. We don't want somebody to go into the men's room to figure out, oops, I'm in the men's room. Okay, and so the signage needs to be on the latch side of the door, between 48 and 60 inches, no more than 8 inches from the door frame. And that is where a person who is visually impaired is going to look for the signage. It should be consistent. Now, learning disabilities are all over the spectrum. Okay, we've got people who have dyslexia, which is difficulty reading. And dyslexia is actually far more than that. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's dyscalculia. I knew I was going to mess that up, which is difficulty with math. And some people think that they have a math disability, and a lot of times it's just not their thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a disability. But there is a true disability for difficulty with math. Dysgraphia is disability with writing. Dyspraxia, difficulty with fine motor skills. There's dysphasia and aphasia, which has difficulty with languages. There is auditory processing disorder, which is difficulty hearing difference between sounds. Like sometimes they can only hear low sounds or only hear high sounds. So when somebody is talking and they have different inflection of their voice, they're only hearing part of it. Then there's ADD and ADHD, which is an attention deficit disorder. And then there's just hyperactivity. And then there's a whole spectrum of autism. And you can have somebody who is very high functioning with autism and somebody who is not as high functioning with autism. And there's a lot of variations in between. So what does all that mean for the design? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do to help people who have these differences. Now, a lot of these differences are not cognitive impairments, okay? In other words, a person who is dyslexic, for instance, tends to have a really high IQ. They memorize everything because they can't read. And we're going to go into why that is here in just a second. But for a second, let's simulate a cognitive impairment, okay? So on the next few slides, I want you to think to yourself or say out loud what color the slide is. Okay, now the reason I did that is because I said, what color is the slide? Your brain, your eyes read the word, your brain automatically went to the word because that's how we're set up. And then you stopped and you went, wait a minute, she said the slide. Then you had to change your brain's thought from orange to green. Okay, that's a cognitive impairment. It just takes another second to put things together. Okay, it doesn't make you any less smart. It just sometimes the way the brain works, it puts things together differently, and it takes a little bit longer. And so you might be talking to somebody who kind of stops for a second and has to think about what you just said. And that's just normal. Okay, we all do it. We do it more as we get older, but we all do it to a certain degree. But a person who has a learning disability, it's more regular. It's more frequent. Now, oops, forgot one. Now, dyslexia is kind of interesting. So people think of it as a reading issue, but here's really what it is. If you look at this letter, I assume you see a B. If you look at this letter, you see a P. If you look at this letter, you see a D. And if you look at this letter, you see a Q. To somebody who is dyslexic, that's all the same letter. Their brain doesn't care if it's this way, this way, this way, or this way. It's the same letter. So when they are trying to read something, this is what they're seeing. So it's not that they can't read, it's that reading doesn't make sense to them because their brain is reading those 4 letters interchangeably. So a lot of people don't understand that. Another thing about dyslexia, there are 2 main types of people. There are those that, and I'm just talking about you at work, okay? You and your coworkers. Some of you have your desks perfectly neat. Others have piles of stuff on top of them. Well, guess what? Those of you who have piles of stuff probably have some form of dyslexia because the brain is unable to establish order. A lot of people don't associate that with dyslexia. It is. If you've got a child who has a hard time doing their homework, put them in the room, in a dark room, and put a light on their homework. Because it's not that they're not interested in their homework. They're just as interested in what the dog's doing, that sock that's on the floor, and that the shirt is over there. They're interested in everything. By the way, this is what that actually said. So, why am I telling you all of this? Well, first of all, it's easier to design something when you understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people opportunities to learn. And like I said before, with design for people with visual impairments, flooring changes, texture changes, those kinds of things are really helpful. When we've got somebody with cognitive impairments, there are special rooms that you might need to make room for, that you might need to design. So for instance, a sensory room. Sometimes you have people who are can't handle sensory overload, or you have people who need to learn how to handle use their various senses. A sensory room is designed specifically to combine a range of different types of stimuli, and that helps them both develop and learn how to engage their senses. So you can have different types of lights, colors, sounds, soft play objects, smells, incorporating all of the different senses, and that becomes a safe environment for them to learn. This is another type of sensory room, and they've got different textures and things on the wall. You know, it doesn't have to be designed to be a sensory room like this one is. Any room can be turned into a sensory room, but it's so much better when it's designed to do that. And so that's something that I would talk to every school district that I did work for about how can we make a good, effective sensory room. Quiet rooms are another thing. We've got people who get overstimulated and they need to be in a quiet room. Now, the purpose of a quiet room is to provide a place where they can kind of unwind, they can cool off, especially if they have some forms of autism like Asperger's disease, or Asperger's syndrome, I'm sorry, that causes more violent reactions. So a safe room is going to have safe furniture. It's going to have acoustical walls so that it takes out a lot of the sound. And so again, they can turn any room into a safe room or a quiet room. What they used to do is hang those big gym mats on a wall in a closet and put somebody in a closet with a light on. And it was nothing more than a padded room. Well, that's going to make somebody feel like they're being punished. Okay. And punishing isn't really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to give them a place to just kind of debrief, unwind, cool off. And so it's okay for that to be done in a beautifully designed room that has nice soft furniture and you know, if they're still wanting to throw things, they can throw pillows and whatever it is that they need individually that's going to be safe, but it's not locking them in a you know, padded room. That just doesn't accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes they have safe rooms, or if it's not a visual stimulation, it's an audible stimulation that they need to get away from. In a glass room like this, where they still can see things going on, they could still be distracted. But if it's just noises that they're trying to get away from, this would be fine. Okay, so it really just depends on what it is we're trying to achieve. Or you have students who they won't eat at school because they don't want anyone to see them eat. A quiet room is also a good place for them to go for eating disorders and things like that. These are just other variations of rooms that can be used for calming purposes. Different types of seating. These are just, they're kind of like the big exercise balls that they use cut in half. But, you know, they're very soft and pliable, and, you know, using different types of furniture, using different types of flooring, different types of wall covering can really help cut down a lot of the distractions that kids get in school. This is gaming stations for people who have mobility impairments. So we don't often think about that. We don't often think about how does a child without motor skills do what all of the other kids are doing today, which is, you know, playing with games. Well, they've got different types of gaming apparatuses for people with varying skill sets. And so maybe they have a little area in the library or in a resource room or something where they have these available. Now, when it comes to the playground, there's so much to think about. There's just so much to think about. We've got to think about inside the play area. We've got to think about outside the play area. We want to try to get kids as engaged in play as they can be, regardless of what their abilities are. So we have to think about, first of all, what are our ground level accessible routes? Okay, the clear width of the ground level accessible routes to a playground need to be at least 60 inches, which is different than ADA that says 36 inches. So we need to remember that. It can narrow to 36, like to get around a tree or something, but it needs to be 60 inches wide. We want to avoid changes in level that as much as possible. So we want the path of travel to be smooth. The running slope, as I said earlier, if it's less than 5%, then you don't have to treat it as a ramp. Once you hit 5%, by definition, it's a ramp. Now we have to treat it like a ramp. Okay, so if you've got enough room to keep the slopes under 5%, then I'd put them on the plans at like 4.5%. Don't do 5% maximum, because then we come out and we measure and we're at 4.8, 4.8, 4.9, whoops, 5.1. Now, is this whole thing a ramp or isn't it? Because it went over 5%. Don't ask somebody to make a judgment call on something that you built, okay, or that you designed. Put it on the plans at like 4.5%. Then if it goes over 5%, we clearly know it's a contractor error. Cross slope should never be more than 2%. Now, let me kind of emphasize that. The reason it's supposed to be no more than 2% is because a lot of people who are in wheelchairs who have had spinal cord injuries or spinal cord involvement, they don't have balance. They don't have front to back. They don't have side to side. So if they start to tip, they can't correct themselves like we can. So if they hit a big cross slope, they could tip right over. Now, I am currently on my 11th death-related ADA case, okay? And 5 of those 11 cases dealt with sidewalks and exterior routes. So for instance, tree roots grew And we had a sidewalk that instead of having a 2% cross slope, it had an 11.4% cross slope. She hit that, it tipped her over. There happened to be a fire hydrant right there. She hit her head and it killed her. Well, you know, we don't want any part of that kind of thing. We want to make sure that that we're providing a safe path of travel that anybody can use. If there are openings or gaps, those openings can be no more than a ½ an inch. So if you've got if you've got an expansion joint between 2 blocks of concrete, and you put something down in there, wood or caulk or whatever you put down in there, from a maintenance standpoint, we need to make sure that it stays there. Otherwise, you just have a big gap, and that could become a problem. And then we have to watch, some of the play areas have arches that you have to go under, and those arches have to be 80 inches in order for them not to be considered an overhead protrusion. And so you kind of have to watch that, your vertical clearance. And then surfacing is kind of the biggest thing when it comes to playgrounds and play equipment. I'm always going to recommend the poured in place. And the reason I recommend that, I know it's more expensive up front, but from a longevity standpoint, there's very little maintenance. And so it doesn't, it's cheaper in the long run, but we'll talk about that as we move forward here. All right, so you have to think about accessible surfaces. You also have to think about safety. All right, and so there are 2 different ASTM standards that you have to follow for a playground. So the ASTM F1292-99 or -04, those deal mostly with your safety around what are referred to as drop zones. If a child fell, how far can they fall, you know, and be protected. And so one of the standards is really more based on safety, but you have to have a good mix between safety and accessibility. And there are a lot of different types of surfacing that you can utilize. So for instance, if you go to the National Center, the website is ncaonline.org, NCA, National Center on Accessibility, online.org. And they have all kinds of studies that they have done on exterior surfacing and types of playground material. And for instance, you're allowed, and this is the other ASTM surface or regulation that you have to pay attention to, ASTM F1951-99. That one is going to give you different surfacing types that are acceptable. And for instance, your manufactured wood fiber is considered an acceptable surface. Here's the problem. As soon as the kids play in it and it's all over the place and it's different, you know, it has to be raked almost every day in order for it to be maintained in an accessible condition. It's very high maintenance. Now, you can't just use mulch. It has to be the manufactured wood fiber. And the reason is mulch is going to absorb moisture and you're going to end up with mold and things like that. But the manufactured wood fiber is designed in a way that it's not going to absorb that moisture and it's going to be healthier for the kids in the long run. And it is considered an accessible surface. You can't use sand, you can't use pea gravel, you can't use a lot of the things that we used to see in playgrounds. So this is the NCA playground surface study, and they've studied all these different types of surfacing, and they have reports on them that you can get from their website. Or you're always welcome to contact me as well. When it comes to playthings, the actual equipment, we have to figure out what experiences are you offering. If you're putting together a playground for an elementary school, what experiences are you offering? You've got swinging, you've got sliding, you've got spinning, you've got rocking. And then we have to make sure at least one of each of those is accessible, so that a person in a wheelchair can slide and spin and, you know, all of the things that their friends are doing they have at least one opportunity to do those. And they've got a lot of really cool playground equipment now that works for everybody. And so always consider me a resource. You're always welcome to come to Accessology. You can find me and send emails, and I'll send you whatever information that I have on any of this stuff. Okay, these are really cool new types of playground equipment. I'll show you my favorite one in just a minute, that allows them to have some of the same experiences as all of their able-bodied friends. Monkey bars for kids in wheelchairs. I think that, I mean, the kids that aren't in wheelchairs are still going to play on them, but it allows a kid in a wheelchair to get that same experience. I think that's pretty cool. All right, so at this point, it is whatever questions that you have, feel free to contact me. Accessology.com is my website. Pretty easy to remember. My name is Christy Avalos. You're more than welcome to consider me a resource. And I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope you have a great day.